Mariam's hands were still warm from the akara oil when she heard the rustle of notes inside the worn leather wallet she had scooped up from beneath a danfo seat. If she did not return it, the rumor that a street vendor had snatched a gentleman's wallet would cost her stall, her oldest child's school fees, and possibly the single roof over her mother and grandchildren. What would they eat if the market committee shut her out? Who among the hurried Lagos faces would believe the woman who had always kept an extra sachet of sugar for a neighbor? And why was the owner watching from behind dark glass as she tucked the wallet into her apron? The man's car smelled of new leather and peppermint, a contrast to the red earth and generator smoke of Mile 12. And he was not just any man. Someone muttered "billionaire" as the sun turned the puddles copper, and that whisper promised shock or salvation. Who was he, and why would a hidden billionaire put a lost wallet into a stranger's palms as if testing a soul? The answer hung heavy in the humid air, like the harmattan breath that would come, waiting to be pulled open. Mariam's ordinary world smelled of frying oil and fuel, of wet red earth after a sudden rain that left the market stones slippery and the danfo horns blaring like distant horns of warning. She kept a tidy stall under a torn tarp on the corner of the market, trading akara and small trays of puff-puff for the passage of families and students, and she lived with her mother, Bisi, and her son Tunde in a cramped single room above a haberdashery. She had learned honesty from her father, a fisherman from Badagry who taught her that an honest hand is a market's brightest currency, and she shielded Bisi's frail back when the cold harmattan bit. The phrase "street vendor returned a lost wallet" had become a small legend in the market. People liked to talk, but for Mariam it was a part of how she fed her children. She counted her small blessings each night by the humming generator downstairs and the distant prayers from the mosque and the nearby church courtyard, both of which reminded her that community kept people upright when life wanted to buckle them, and she believed, stubbornly, that honesty would not leave them hungry. The inciting moment happened at noon under a sky stitched with heat. She found the wallet, thick with notes and a glossy card that smelled faintly of a perfume she could not afford, and a crowd gathered like a slow tide when she circled the market asking, "Who lost this?" A man in a gray suit who offered her a hand and a ride to return it seemed kind, saying, "You did well, madam," in a voice polished as his shoes. But when she hesitated because the market boss wanted proof, he suggested, "Let me handle this. I have friends at the station," and his smile was a wolf's fur over teeth. She could feel the weight of possibility. If the wallet belonged to someone powerful, returning it might be a blessing. If she kept it, well, the press of hungry months and a landlord's patience had teeth. The man's kindness felt heavy and watched. Who was he really, and what would his help cost? Tension tightened like the strap of her worn bag. The first trial snapped like a fish line. A market tout accused her of pocketing the wallet when a petty influencer recorded a 5-second clip that made it look as if she had slipped something into her apron, and the clip spread faster than a dropped pounded yam in the rain. The Market Association froze her stall license pending investigation, and the first cost arrived at her door in the form of Oga Sule, the debt collector who wanted his small cut for past credit. She had to borrow from a neighbor at the risk of being shamed, and customers, when they saw the whispering circles and the danfo horns, drifted past her stall as if the rumor could stain them too. Who would speak when the market needed a voice? And could she pay the neighbor back before the generator noise stopped and the lights in their room went dark? The question was a stone thrown into their sleeping pond. Just as she found a new rhythm of small favors to patch the gap, a wolf in sheep's clothing struck. Auntie Nkechi, who had taken Mariam under the warm hood of a cousin-like friendship and sold her the idea of a microloan that would save her stall, offered to stand as guarantor and wrote her name on documents Mariam did not read because the letter's ink smelled of opportunity. Auntie Nkechi comforted her with soup and whispers of good days, but the microloan was a trap, fees stacked like plates, And when the smear campaign escalated, Nkechi quietly signed over Mariam's tiny savings box as collateral to a buyer across the market. Mariam believed in family protection and felt betrayed as the market's generator hummed a low, unending sermon. She had trusted a familiar face and found a knife. How could a woman who taught her to braid hair now braid lies into her life? The pattern of setbacks deepened. The market manager, a man who always bowed and said, "God bless your hustle," turned out to be a paper tiger who loved his row of parking spaces for SUVs more than he loved the people who paid his rent. He began demanding a fee for protection that Mariam could not meet, and the landlord threatened eviction by dawn if the arrears weren't cleared. Tunda's school informed her that uniforms and exam fees were overdue, and a coughing fit from her mother made the clinic bills stack like unwelcome prayers. The red earth outside their room dried under the sun as if time was trying to erase any chance of reprieve. A stranger offered a quick deal: sign away a piece of paperwork, get a lump sum, save the family. The wolfed man whispered, "No one needs to know." What cost would she pay for that secret, and who would remain when the dust settled? On a day when the harmattan breathed a thin silver into the market and the smell of pepper soup hung warm against her face, a sleek black SUV idled at the edge of the chaos with someone watching from tinted glass, a presence like a cliff beyond the marketplace plain. The man she had returned the wallet to days before stepped out, but not as a man who sought his pocketbook. He moved through the market differently, noting the generator hum, touching the tarpaulin flaps like a man mapping a landscape he had once ignored, and he carried a business card that read, "Chief Obina Ease." Rumors fluttered. Was he the billionaire who had lost the wallet? Was his watching merely curiosity? Or had he set this moment to uncover honesty? The sight of his polished shoes on red earth felt like a pattern interrupt, a change in the film reels of Mariam's life. How did one man's attention tilt a whole market's life? In the small mosque courtyard that smelled of lemon and old prayer rugs, or in the church's cool shadow where organ practice had momentarily ceased, Mariam did something ordinary and impossible to measure. She shared the last of her akara with an elderly woman whose feet were swollen and whose hands trembled during the noon prayer, and when a rain began she used her torn umbrella to cover a cluster of children waiting for their danfo. The act was small: 2 fried balls of akara tucked into a wrapper, a hand on an old woman's shoulder. And it was witnessed by a quiet figure watching from the shade, a man whose eyes were the color of money and river silt, the same man who had once peered from a car window at a lost wallet. He scribbled a note on a receipt and folded it into a corner of his leather wallet, as if recording something that might matter later. On his face, the softness of surprise. The kindness was a seed, and although Mariam thought no one powerful saw, someone had, and it would matter. The pressure mounted like a storm rolling inland. "By dawn," the landlord said with a blade's smile, and the market association set a hearing for 2 days to determine if she had stolen the wallet. Tunda's teacher called about state exams and asked if Mariam could produce fees by the end of the week. The debt collectors tightened their calendars, the microloan collectors circled like vultures, and the thought of BC's cough at night made each hour heavier with consequence. Eviction now meant the difference between dignity and shame in the market spread and stuck like oil. Time compressed into red leather straps and receipts. Every minute ticked like a timer over Mariam's small world. What could she do in 3 days that would buy more than money? The second pressure cooker sealed. An online video of her being accused played on a local WhatsApp group with angry comment. And Terry, and the market's patron saint, in the form of a loud radio presenter, called for an example to be made. The association demanded she repay the loan immediately, or they would repossess her stall for the safety of traders. The billboard-backed lawyers in suit jackets whispered about legal action, while a few sympathetic neighbors closed their shutters to avoid trouble, and the community's safety net frayed into thin strings. If the billionaire was interested, Now was the moment to step forward or to walk away. Every choice would force a new life or a new kind of exile. The countdown burned into her palms. 59% through the storm, the film of life rewound and revealed its secret. The man in the polished shoes was Chief Obina Ease, a billionaire industrialist who had orchestrated the wallet's loss as a test to find partners for a new social investment program focused on trust, and he stepped into the market square not to buy headlines but to find people who could be trusted to run a fund that would uplift the very vendors who fed the city. He had watched the clip and the rumors with a sorrow that surprised him, and when he saw Miriam sheltering children with her umbrella, he recognized in public honesty the fragile backbone of community. The revelation reframed everything. The wallet was never a trap to catch a thief, it was a key to a door. Chief Ease wanted opened to real, everyday integrity, and his assistant documented her kindness with a bowed head. Now Miriam's choices were not simply about paying debts, they were about whether to become part of a larger plan that would change the balance of power between people and the rich. Darkness came swift and cold in the hours before dawn. Even after Chief Ease made discreet inquiries, the Market Association convened a public hearing that became a stage for humiliation. The wolf in sheep's clothing, the man in the gray suit, leaned into the microphone and offered a counterfeit story of a vendor who had always been opportunistic. And Auntie Nkechi, flushed with fear and debt, nearly collapsed under the weight of her lies. It would have been easy then for Miriam to take the private envelope the man from the SUV offered, money, silence, a quick fix for eviction, and slip back into obscurity with her family fed for a season. But she thought of her father's hands, of the umbrella over wet children, of Bc's cough, and she chose the harder piece. She stood and said with a voice like soft steel, "This is my word." There was no deus ex machina. Her choice flowed from a lifetime of small, honest acts that now shaped the only honest path. The climax unfurled like a storm breaking over the lagoon. Chief Obina did not make a spectacle of his wealth, but he did make a spectacle of truth, producing surveillance footage from the Danfo depot, paying for a proper review of the clips, and insisting that the police investigate the market manager and the gray-suited man who had coached false testimony. Legal papers were signed in the hum of the generator and under the watch of both mosque and church courtyards. The market manager's grip on parking fees loosened as officers took statements, and the gray-suited wolf, who had been using his help to launder favors and take small bribes, found his own name trending for corruption, his job dissolving like oil in rainy water. On screen, the moment justice landed was simple. The lock on Miriam's stall was removed, her license returned, and the accusing clip was corrected in a public statement that Chief Obina insisted on broadcasting at the market's weekly meeting. The audience cheered and some cried. The consequence for the antagonist was visible. The wolf's car left with empty seats, and the market manager's papers changed hands. In the second beat of the climax, Chief Obina did not merely hand Miriam a check. He offered mentorship, a fund to support honest vendors, a place on the advisory board of a cooperative that would buy the land they occupied to protect traders from greedy landlords, and a micro-grant to repay the microloan debts of several honest women who had been ensnared by similar tricks. Miriam accepted, but on her own terms. She would not be a charity case. She wanted a seat at the table so she could ensure the program respected dignity and local knowledge. The market, once threatened by SUVs and the sharp voices of powerful men, began to hum with a new confidence. New tarpaulins, a small solar light bank so the generator hummed less, and a community savings ledger signed in the midday sun. The power reversal stung the old guards, who saw the skyline of their influence shift toward the hands of people who had always been there. The resolution shaped a new normal. Miriam's small room above the haberdashery was replaced by a simple cemented home with a tin roof that did not leak when the red earth turned to river. Tunda's school fees were caught up and a scholarship was arranged for his promising handwriting, and Bisi's cough was treated with proper medicine paid through the cooperative's first clinic fund. Mariam's new stall had a neat sign and a small box where customers could deposit tips for the elderly, and she started a savings circle that trained other vendors in accounting on evenings when the generator hummed quietly and the danfo horns faded. Life now held more comfortable meals and a sense that the market could be both a place of trade and of trust. And each was measured in the small, tangible things: a steady light, a repaired umbrella, a child's proper uniform. On the wider street, the balance had shifted visibly. SUVs still glinted, but they parked within rules set by the people who opened their palms to the city, not above them. The danfo horn still cried their urgent songs, but the market had a board of traders who voted on fees and kept an eye on predators. Mariam used her seat on the cooperative's board to push for fair rents and transparent microloans to ensure no wolf in sheep's clothing could prey again. When Auntie Nkechi came seeking a hand, Mariam offered it, but checked the papers with a steady, learned eye. The community had been mended not by a single check, but by a structure that rewarded honesty and punished exploitation, and when rain turned the red earth into a mirror, people danced barefoot without fear of being swept away. Kindness plants seeds that sometimes lie sleeping until a rainy season wakes them. Truth takes longer to travel, but when it arrives with a weight that can topple towers built on whispers. Never judge a life by one chapter. Some of the richest rooms are those where people learn to keep trust as their currency. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments which part made you believe in honesty again, and share your own small act of kindness below. Subscribe for another modern folktale from across Africa, like and share this story to help it reach a neighbor, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next life that changes under a red earth sky. 2 weeks slipped by like a slow drumbeat when the market woke to a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial. The generator throbbed less, solar lights flashed on fresh tarpaulins, and at the center, Chief Obina Ize's Community Trust Fund banner fluttered above stalls like a new flag. Mariam was invited to a briefing, then to a seat on the board, a tiny chair with a big voice. And the morning she said yes, she saw something gleaming in the billionaire's eyes, not pride, but a wary hope that the city could be organized by those who had learned to endure hunger without surrendering truth. The interval beat had arrived. The truth that started this film was not a single mercy, but a long, patient architecture, and now the city asked Mariam to help lay its foundation. Would she risk the small, steady trust of her neighbors for a shared future that might not look like the one she imagined when she stood under the tarpaulin counting coins and fears? The first test came quickly. A ceremonial grant distribution meant to show power and control, and in the crowd a dozen sharp eyes watched to see if the story would tilt toward justice or toward the old trick of moving money through a few private hands. The market manager, hollowed by exposure, tried a last stunt, calling a hurried vote to appoint a loyal trustee who would protect him rather than the people, and the crowd murmured like a river about to burst its banks. Mariam's heart beat like a drum in her throat, but she remembered her father's words and the umbrella she had shared with a sick child, and she pressed her palm against the new board's notice and spoke softly, but with practice. Honesty is work, not a slogan. A line as simple as a kara that steadied the room. Chief Obina nodded, the way a captain nods at a storm he has studied, and midway through the paragraph the midpoint turning arrived. The foundation's audit uncovered a thief. Reed of deceit woven by Nkechi's fear, the collateral she had pledged had not been merely hers but had been courted and multiplied by a shadowy lender who wanted to own a piece of the market's heart, a fact that made Nkechi cry and then tremble with relief when Mariam spoke up for mercy and for due process, not vengeance. The turning moment came when a junior staffer, a quiet woman from the bench market, produced a ledger printout that showed every donation, every loan, every repayment, all logged with time stamps and signatures that could be traced to the cooperative's own tablet, and the room exhaled as if a choking hall had been opened to air. Chief Obina's assistant slid Mariam a small envelope, and inside lay a formal invitation to co-chair a newly created integrity circle that would oversee all disbursements in village clinics alike, a public ledger made real, a promise that even the richest among them would not buy silence again. The mid-paragraph shift rewrote the terms of the game. The wealthy donor's power now resided in transparency, not in suppression. The people's word could bind money to accountability, and the old eviction machine would no longer breathe without a consent that came from the street's honest hearts. The second beat of the interval, the public resolution, followed. The hearing that would have become another humiliation now became a demonstration of consequence. The gray-suited man who had coached lies found himself cornered by video proving he had orchestrated a fake whistleblower. The landlord's office ran on a different clock now that a public fund demanded monthly reporting, and a janitor in the market who never spoke English but could count coins predicted the outcome with a nod. When the people hold the keys, the doors open for everyone. Auntie Nkechi, who had walked in with pride and left with fear, confessed on the stand that she had signed papers not fully read, but insisted she had been promised protection for her family. Mariam rose and, with the calm of someone who had learned to tell the truth in a storm, spoke to the crowd about forgiveness and accountability, about the price of safety for a child who had never asked for wealth, but only for a future where a boy could write his exams without the fear of arrears, where a grandmother could breathe without coughing with the relief of a clinic funded by the same people who had fed her on akara and something sweet in the rain of harmattan. The crowd's response was not applause alone, but a soft flood of nodding heads, a neighbor's hand reaching toward the next stall to offer a loan in the right kind of way, one that would be repaid, and on time, and in a way that kept the ledger clean and the trust growing. On the interval's next turn, a quiet, almost cinematic reversal unfolded. The billionaire, who had funded all of this not to own the city, but to return it to its people, stepped onto the makeshift stage with a simple spare speech that did not shout wealth, but named responsibility. He admitted that he could have bought the market's silence with a private fund, but chose instead to fund a public table where every voice could be heard, including the small, stubborn voice of a mother who once divided her last akara with a stranger in need. His closing line, "Trust is not a favor, it is permission to dream and to act," landed like a coin in a tin cup, and the audience, vendors, students, and grandmothers alike, felt the room tilt toward a new kind of justice. The consequence was immediate. The cooperative's governance charter was signed, the land lease was rewritten in favor of the vendors, and the first installments of microgrants to repair roofs, buy danfo passes for students, and stock medical supplies began to flow. Mariam's seat on the board symbolized not charity but partnership, a model that would outpace old lines of power and price gouging with simple things: timely repairs, fair rents, honest accounting, and a place at the table for two hoes who had learned to survive with courage and kindness. The resolution of this chapter did not erase hardship, it redefined it. When Bisi's cough grew lighter, and the generator hummed a softer tune, when Tunda wore a proper uniform and carried his first test paper with a bright line on the top, when the market's tarpaulin fluttered with a shared new banner that read simply, "We rise together," the city began to see the difference between help that shelters and help that enslaves. Mariam's life, once measured by fear of eviction and the sting of scandal, now measured by the rhythm of monthly meetings, the glow of a solar bank in the old market corner, the sound of community members saving together under the same roof, and the satisfied quiet in the children's eyes when they could focus on school rather than the clock counting debt. The interval's end left a single thread loose, and Kechi's debt had been lifted, yes, but a second, more insidious debt, selective memory, and the temptation to leverage future favors could still pull at the edges of this new order. She would be watched, and she would have to prove that she could walk within the rules now laid out, not rewrite them. The scene then shifted to the underpass where the danfo horns sang a rough but hopeful lullaby, and a new sign was mounted at the cooperative gate, a promise that their days of hunger would not determine their dignity again. The last image would be the camera catching Mariam as she helps a fresh vendor tie a banner to a pole, her hands steady, her smile steady, a small bright beacon under a red earth sky. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments which part made you believe in honesty again, and share your own small act of kindness below. Subscribe for another modern folktale from across Africa. Like and share this story to help it reach a neighbor, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next life that changes under a red earth sky. 2 weeks slipped by like a slow drumbeat when Mariam stepped into the market's makeshift briefing hall beside the shade of the haberdashery, the Integrity Circle banner snapping in a tempered breeze, Chief Obina's name chalked cleanly on a board that had once hosted eviction notices, and the reporters' cameras pushed back against the sun as if they too could learn to see honesty in the light of a new dawn. She carried the memory of the umbrella sheltering a child, and the weight of the last ledger printout that had proved a web of truth, and the immediate stakes hammered at her. Would the circle keep faith with every vendor? Would Nkechi's fear become accountability without spiraling someone else into debt? And would she herself be able to stand again before a crowd that could turn hopeful or hostile in a breath? The room smelled of polished wood and a faint lemon zest from a cleaner's bucket, and the murmurs rose like a distant sea as the startup funds and monthly audits were laid out in simple charts, a language designed to be read by those who count pepper in a palm and count hours on a generator, not by those who fear the next eviction letter. A kid flashed a bright newspaper boy's smile at her as if to say, "This is a moment you can touch," and she answered with a nod and the quiet courage that had carried her through a dozen mornings when the market mania pressed in from all sides. The first micro cliffhanger stretched early. A clerk slid a sealed envelope across the table to Mariam, not addressed to her alone but to the cooperative's co-chair, with a second note tucked inside the envelope's waxy fold, a tip, a warning, or a piece of truth hidden in plain sight. And she could sense that someone watched from the edge of the crowd, the same watcher who had once glided through the gray-suited lies, the one who preferred not to be named and yet would not disappear, who. Will the note reveal a secret ally or a creeping threat? Act 2. Engine surged as the briefing shifted from ceremony to duty. The fund would soon disburse the first grants aimed at roofs, water, clinic stock, and school uniforms, but only if the circle could demonstrate transparent processes, verifiable receipts, and public accountability. The room's faces settled into a poised seriousness that made the red dust outside seem farther away, and Mariam felt the old fear soften into a steady, careful plan. A young woman from the bench market rose to describe how a stomach-churning fear had kept her from the ledger, how she had learned to count not coins but trust, and how the women of the market now met every week under a solar lamp to practice ledgers and savings. The sound of chalk against the board and the soft clack of coins in a donated tin box stitched the moment together, and then the mid-paragraph turning point came like a hard gust. An understated but undeniable fact surfaced through a technician's screen, a ledger audit that traced a chain of donations and repayments back to a single, silent donor whose name did not appear in the day's public record. Nkechi's fears suddenly aligned with a darker pattern that suggested someone outside the market's circle might be using her to launder influence, a shadow lender whose hand would not be seen until money moved in a very particular direction. The room hushed, and the crowd's breath appeared as a visible thing in the heat, questions forming in quick, careful syllables. What about the mail receipts? Who printed the donor's name? How did the funds arrive without a trace? And what would happen if this unknown hand bent the circle's transparency into a new kind of cover for manipulation? The serious pivot deepened as Mariam found herself at the table's center, facing both admiration and risk. The board's chair asked her to read aloud the ledger's line items, not to accuse but to illuminate, and as she spoke, she could feel Chief Obina's gaze track every breath she took, a watchful patience in his eyes that reminded her this moment was larger than any single victory or debt erased. And then, with a measured calm, he stood, a rare moment where the hall's quiet turned to a respectful hush, and he spoke not of wealth or charity, but of responsibility. "Integrity is a public oath," he said, "and we must prove we can keep it, even when the wind changes direction." The crowd's relief was visible in the soft exhale of shoulders, yet a new risk presented itself in a ripple. From the back of the hall, a journalist's voice cut through. "If there is a hidden donor, will you name them publicly, sir, so the market can see the source of trust?" The question landed like a stone, not to trap anyone, but to demand that the money's origin be as clean as the beneficiary's hands. Chief Obina's answer was careful, promising a full public audit, a transparent donor registry, and a televised town hall where vendors could ask questions without the fear of being shamed or silenced. The interval beat wanted drama, and this was it. The real test would be whether the circle could withstand a storm of scrutiny without losing its humanity. Midway through the paragraph, the turning point sharpened. The enclosed envelope opened to reveal a second, smaller note, and within it a photograph, a faded image of Nkechi's cousin, long absent, shown in a room with the bank's logo on a wall, a reminder that the debt she bore had deeper roots than one vendor's fear. Suddenly the moral fog cleared enough for Mariam to see how easily generosity could get co-opted and how forgiveness without boundary could become a loophole, but also how courage could redefine a family's fate. She spoke again, this time not just for herself, but for the chorus of women who had fed kids with akara and carried lamps for late-night study. "If a debt is owed to this community, it is owed to every child who sleeps with a full stomach and a quiet heart." Her words did not punish Nkechi, but reframed the problem. The circle would redraw the loan's terms, remove punitive penalties, and require any future guarantors to be vetted through a weekly open ledger review, a rule that shifted power from private favors to public accountability. The crowd clapped, the cameras flashed, and even the gray-suited adversaries looked away, as if the ground itself had tilted toward fairness. The closing loop arrived with a visible consequence. The Audit and Integrity Circle approved the first wave of grants. A roof repaired here, a clinic stocked there, uniforms distributed with a dignity that did not shout wealth, but announced it in quiet, reliable hands. And Nkechi, now shielded by a transparent process and a community that would not allow fear to drive them into silence, took a seat on the newly formed Community Credit Committee, not as a patron but as a member, binding her own future to the circle's rules. The old market manager's power waned as the cooperative's governance took the lead, and a last-minute decision, documented, time-stamped, and publicly posted, reassigned a contested stall to a long-standing vendor who had once stood in Mariam's shadow, a small but real reversal that showed the market was no longer a battlefield, but a shared stage where everyone could audition for a better rhythm. The antagonist's consequence arrived in a sharper note. A summons to explain decades of petty coercion, and a hearing that would decide whether he would be allowed to profit from the market again or be relegated to a cautionary tale about how power corrupts when it hides behind courtesy. Mariam's visible progress was not a spectacular flourish, but a steady rise. Her small room replaced by a solar-lit office corner, her son's school fees funded with a steady subsidy, her mother breathing easier, and her own name used in the same breath as trust and governance rather than whispers of theft. a change that felt like the city learning to breathe with a new, slower cadence. And yet one thread remained unclosed, the one that kept the story from becoming merely a victory lap. The shadow lender, their presence reduced, but not erased, their influence still possible if the circle's guard dropped. Their watchful eyes now trained on every disbursement, their fingers tucked into the market's ledger like a silent weather system that could shift again if carelessness crept back into the room. The interval's end settled not in triumph but in vigilance, a quiet promise that the next months would show whether the city would hold or slip, whether the richest and the poorest could share a single earned dignity, and whether Mariam would keep walking between the two worlds, market scramble and boardroom hush, without losing the neighborly fire that had warmed the umbrella and fed the last akara. The post-interval image lingers, a vendor adjusting a new bright sign that reads, "We rise together," a child's exam paper pinned to a corkboard, a torn tarpaulin now replaced with sturdier fabric that glints in the afternoon sun, and Mariam at the center of it all, hands steady as ever, guiding the circle with a voice that has learned to measure power by responsibility rather than by fear. The camera would catch her in a moment of shared laughter with Tunda, the boy no longer just a student but a partner in the market's reform, and BC's steady breath in the doorway of a clinic funded by the same fund that had once set a trap but now held a promise. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments which part made you believe in honesty again and share your own small act of kindness below. Subscribe for another modern folktale from across Africa. Like and share this story to help it reach a neighbor, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next life that changes under a red earth sky. The interval's truth remains. The hidden billionaire identity lives in the line where generosity meets accountability. And the wealth gap is not an unbridgeable gulf, but a bridge built by everyday acts that weigh more than money. While one tight thread, Nkechi's future and the shadow lender's last breath, hangs in the air, inviting the next chapter to cross over from rumor to rule of law, from fear to a future in which the market's heartbeat is steady because its people know they will not be silenced. The film resumes on Mariam's face, calm and clear, as the board's vote is cast, the ledger is opened, and the red earth sky glows with the soft light of a city learning to stay together.